I think it's safe to say that prologues are a point of division within the writing. There are a lot of readers and writers out there who don't like them. You'll see a lot of blanket advice from people that say you should avoid prologues entirely. And I don't have any stats on this, but I imagine there are a large group of people who don't read prologues at all. Now, while some of this criticism is justified, and overall I would say that prologues have become a bit of a cliche, that doesn't mean they aren't a useful tool. When done well, a prologue can be a great way to add some excitement to the beginning of a novel. They are a great tool for setting the tone of your story and can give you one more place to exposit. And in my own personal opinion, they can be a lot of fun to write. Now, in order to write a good prologue, you need to understand what the purpose of a prologue is and decide whether a prologue is right for your story. If you've decided that a prologue is right for your story, you also need to avoid some common mistakes when writing a prologue. Let's start by talking about what a prologue is and what purpose it serves. First of all, a prologue is distinct from other things that come at the beginning of a novel, like an introduction, preface, or foreword, although all of these things are grouped into what's known as the front matter of a book. While the other parts of the front matter serve to provide background information about the book, and in the case of the introduction and foreword are usually reserved for nonfiction, the prologue is actually part of the narrative and takes place within the same universe as the story. It may or may not take place in exactly the same setting or at the same time or deal with the same characters as the main narrative, but the information presented in a prologue is necessary to understand the rest of the story. We'll talk more about that later on. The main purpose of a prologue is pretty much the same as the rest of the story, to provide the reader with information about the plot, setting, or characters that they need to be aware of in order to enjoy the story. So if it basically serves the same purpose as the rest of the story and takes place in the same universe, why do prologues exist at all? Why not just call this chapter 1 and avoid all the controversy? Well, the main reason is flexibility. Prologues give you the option to start your story at a different time or with a different set of characters in a way that won't upset the reader. The reader is going to assume that the characters and setting introduced in chapter 1 are what we are going to be seeing for the rest of the story. Having one group of characters in chapter 1 at a specific time and then jumping to a completely different time with different characters in chapter 2 can be jarring for the reader. Really, the fact that we call something a prologue instead of just chapter 1 is to signal to the reader that we are only here temporarily, and when we get to the main body of the narrative, we might be dealing with different characters or a different time or setting. Because you have more freedom around the viewpoint, setting, and time period of your prologue, it also makes it easier to deliver information to the reader that might otherwise be difficult. This can be used to good effect to create suspense if you share a piece of information that the protagonist doesn't become aware of until later. So that's really all a prologue is, a way to get information across to the reader with the flexibility to change where, how, and who delivers this information. There's other reasons for the prologue to exist, but I think that's kind of the main one. Now that we know the purpose of a prologue, how can you decide if you need one? Honestly, this is mostly a creative decision, and there are no hard and fast rules about when a prologue works and when it doesn't. A skilled writer can probably make the same story work with or without a prologue, and there's not really a way to know that you need a prologue until the whole story is down on paper. So I wouldn't worry too much about whether or not to include a prologue. You can always go back and add or remove it if it makes the story better. You may find as you get through your story that you didn't actually need the prologue that you've written, or you might come up with an idea for a prologue that could really improve the story. Now, there are a few things you can ask yourself to maybe help with the decision. First, can you take advantage of the flexibility that a prologue provides? Is there crucial information that you can get to the reader from a different time or perspective that would be difficult to incorporate into the normal introduction of the story? Next, could you potentially build some suspense by giving the reader a piece of information that the protagonists don't have? This could be done through a prologue that happens before the main events of the story, or it could happen in the future after the events of the story happen. Another useful way to use a prologue is to flesh out a character's backstory. If you have a major event that happened in your character's life several years before the beginning of the actual story, you can show this in a prologue. Lastly, is the beginning of your story lacking excitement? If it is, you could potentially write a prologue to make it more exciting. This is something we haven't talked about yet, but a lot of times a prologue is used to add a bit of excitement to a story, which might begin a little slowly. If your story is even loosely following something like the hero's journey, then your protagonist is likely starting out the story as a moisture farmer or living in the Shire or carrying a bridge around. This generally means there's some time before we get to the actual exciting parts of the story, and a prologue can get us there a little earlier by starting with a more exciting scene. There's other things to consider when deciding if you need a prologue. A prologue can do many other things and fix other problems than what I've described here. Regardless of the reasons that you choose to write a prologue, there are some pitfalls that you should avoid. Your prologue must provide information that is critical to the reader's understanding of the rest of the story. If someone can skip the prologue and understand the rest of the story without issue, then the prologue isn't necessary and can likely be cut. Similarly, if your prologue only serves to add some atmospheric details or some additional information about the setting, then it's likely not having a major impact on the rest of the story and can also be cut. A related issue to this is you don't want to provide too much information. I talked about this in the video on novel beginnings, but info dumping at the beginning of a story is usually not a recipe for success. That applies both to the first chapters of a book and also to the prologue. If your prologue contains too much expository information, then it's likely going to bore the reader and probably should be trimmed down. Next, you need to make sure that the prologue adequately hooks the reader. This is partially because the beginning of a book should always do this, and partially because, as I mentioned at the beginning, you are going to have to win over a significant portion of your audience who just don't like prologues. How to properly hook a reader is a complicated subject, so that's probably best left for another day and another video, but it's incredibly important to do when it comes to prologues. Because the prologues are often happening in a different setting and time with different characters than the rest of the story, you need to very quickly hook the reader into that setting, time, and characters in order to keep them interested. You have a little bit more leeway with the actual main narrative because we're going to be spending many chapters with those characters, so there's more time to hook the reader. Which ties nicely into the next point. You also need to ensure that your prologue isn't too long, for largely the same reasons that you need to hook the reader. A reader who is skeptical of... skeptical? A reader who is unsure about a prologue is likely going to be more unsure if the prologue drags on for pages and pages. You should generally strive to make the prologue as short as possible, and a good rule of thumb that I've seen here is that it shouldn't be longer than your average chapter length. I also think there's some really interesting things that can be done with short prologues, so something to keep in mind. Now, this video is starting to get a little long, so I'm going to end it here. Really, a prologue isn't that much different from any other scene in a book. It needs to convey information that's important to the narrative. You need to make sure that there's an interesting hook for the reader, and it should be absolutely crucial to the understanding of the rest of the story. What the prologue gives you is a little bit more flexibility in the characters and setting that are part of that scene. You're not as constrained as you are with the rest of the book. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing advice videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.